Denise's hands trembled as she hid the tiny camera in her son's coffin. Isaiah's death felt wrong, the bruises on his neck screaming for answers. As the lid closed, she vowed to uncover the truth no matter how horrifying it was. The air felt suffocating as Denise sat in her quiet living room, clutching a framed photo of her 17-year-old son Isaiah. Just days ago, this same house was filled with his laughter, his music echoing from his room upstairs, and the smell of his favorite late-night snacks wafting through the hallways. Now the silence was unbearable. Isaiah was gone. A sudden tragic death had ripped him away, leaving Denise drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. The official report labeled it a natural cause, but something about that didn't sit right with Denise. Her son was healthy, vibrant, and full of life. How could a teenager with no known medical issues simply stop breathing? The doctors offered little clarity, their tone distant, their explanations vague. Isaiah deserved better than that. He deserved answers. As the days passed, the weight of her grief only deepened. Friends and family came and went, offering their condolences, their casseroles and their well-meaning words, but none of it filled the void or quieted the gnawing feeling in her chest. At night she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying their last conversation in her mind. He'd been so excited about his upcoming basketball game, his plans for college applications, his future. How could that future be stolen so suddenly? Then came the whispers. A neighbor speaking in hushed tones at the funeral home mentioned something odd about Isaiah's body. "Did you notice the marks on his neck?" they asked, their voice barely audible, but slicing through Denise's thoughts like a blade. She hadn't noticed, but the comment lingered, growing louder in her mind with each passing moment. But it wasn't just the neighbor's words. Denise couldn't ignore the way the funeral director avoided eye contact when she asked about the autopsy. His answers felt rehearsed, his explanations too quick to brush away her concerns. Something wasn't adding up. Grief turned into suspicion, and suspicion, as Denise would soon learn, had a way of uncovering truths that some people would rather keep buried. But she didn't know yet. This was only the beginning of a journey that would take her places she never imagined she'd go. Denise couldn't shake the unease, the neighbor's words, the funeral director's nervous glances, and even her own intuition. Everything pointed to something being wrong. She found herself obsessing over every detail, replaying every interaction in her mind, hoping to find the piece of the puzzle she was missing. Her first step was to call the medical examiner's office. It took her 2 days to gather the courage, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. The voice on the other end of the line was polite, but robotic. "The autopsy report has been filed. Cause of death, cardiac arrest." "Cardiac arrest," she repeated, her voice cracking. "He was healthy. He never had heart issues." "Can you explain, ma'am?" "The findings are conclusive," the person interrupted. "I'm sorry for your loss." And just like that, the call ended, leaving her with more questions than answers. Desperation pushed her to dig deeper. She went back to the funeral home, under the pretense of discussing burial arrangements, hoping to catch the funeral director off guard. But his answers remained vague, his demeanor stiff. When she asked about the marks on Isaiah's neck, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm her worst fears. "I'm sure it's nothing out of the ordinary," he said quickly, his voice wavering. "Sometimes the body changes post-mortem." Denise knew he was lying. That hesitation, that flicker of fear in his eyes, it was all she needed to see. But the more questions she asked, the more resistance she faced. Friends who had been supportive now urged her to let it go. "You need to focus on healing," they said. "Dwelling on this won't bring him back." Even her own family started to distance. themselves from her relentless pursuit of the truth. Still she pressed on. She requested a copy of the autopsy report, poring over it late into the night. But the medical jargon only frustrated her more. Terms she didn't understand. Inconsistencies she couldn't prove. Yet every page screamed that something was wrong. Her breaking point came when she overheard a conversation between two of Isaiah's teammates. They spoke in hushed voices at the wake, their words barely audible over the murmurs of grieving guests. "Did you hear what really happened to Isaiah?" one of them whispered. "I heard someone messed with him before he—" Denise froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to confront them, but they fell silent, their faces pale with guilt. They wouldn't say another word, no matter how much she pleaded, but their unfinished sentence was enough to make her realize that Isaiah's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cover-up, and if no one else was going to uncover the truth, she'd have to do it herself. Denise's heart raced as she sat in her kitchen, staring at the tiny black device in her hand. It had arrived in the mail earlier that day, a small, inconspicuous hidden camera she'd purchased online. She felt a pang of guilt for even thinking about it. What kind of mother places a camera in her child's coffin? But this wasn't about her. It was about Isaiah. Her mind swirled with the possibilities of what could have happened. The marks on his neck, the funeral director's hesitation, the hushed conversations. None of it made sense. If no one was willing to give her the truth, she would have to find it herself. The night before the funeral, she drove to the funeral home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She had arranged a private viewing, telling the staff she wanted a moment alone to say her final goodbye. That part, at least, was true. When she entered the room, the sight of Isaiah lying there in the coffin nearly broke her. His face, once so full of life and mischief, now looked pale and distant. She whispered a prayer, brushing a strand of his hair from his forehead, before placing the camera discreetly at the base of the coffin, hidden beneath the silk lining. Her hands trembled, her tears falling onto the velvet as she worked quickly. Every part of her wanted to stop. This felt wrong, invasive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Isaiah was counting on her to figure out what had really happened. As she closed the coffin lid, she made a silent promise to her son. "I'll get to the bottom of this no matter what." The next morning, the funeral was a blur of tears and condolences. Denise barely heard the preacher's words or the choir's hymns. All she could think about was the camera, silently recording inside the coffin. After the service, as the guests filed out and the casket was transported to the cemetery, Denise excused herself and sat alone in her car. Her fingers fidgeted with her phone, where the camera's feed was synced. She knew she shouldn't check it so soon. It wasn't safe to draw attention, but the temptation was overwhelming. She opened the app and her heart nearly stopped. At first it was nothing, just the stillness of the inside of the coffin, but then movement, subtle, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Her breath caught as she watched the footage, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. Someone was opening the casket. What she saw next would change everything, but she wasn't ready for the horrifying truth waiting on that screen. Denise's fingers trembled as she gripped her phone, her eyes glued to the screen. The camera footage showed a pair of gloved hands lifting the lid of the coffin. The funeral service had only just ended. How could this be happening already? Her heart pounded as the figure leaned over Isaiah's lifeless body. The person's face was partially obscured by a mask, but their actions were unmistakable. They rifled through Isaiah's pockets, pulling out personal items she hadn't even known were placed in the casket. A bracelet his grandmother had given him, a folded letter from a friend, even his phone items meant to be buried with him. Denise's breath hitched as the figure handled Isaiah's body with cold disregard, shifting him as if he were an object rather than her beloved son. Then came the moment that shattered her entirely. The figure adjusted the collar of Isaiah's shirt, and there, clear as day, were the bruises on his neck, dark, unmistakable, and chillingly precise, like fingerprints pressing into his skin. The masked intruder froze for a moment, as if realizing the marks could be noticed. Denise watched in horror as they reached into a bag, pulled out a small makeup kit, and began covering the bruises. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. Whoever this was, they weren't just stealing, they were hiding evidence. And then the final blow came. The figure pulled out a syringe. Denise couldn't breathe as she watched them inject something into Isaiah's arm, their movements quick and practiced. What could they possibly be doing? Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. The footage ended with the figure calmly closing the coffin lid, leaving no trace of their presence. Denise sat frozen in her car, her body shaking with a mix of anger, fear, and disgust. She replayed the video, hoping she'd misunderstood or missed something. But the evidence was clear. Her son hadn't just died mysteriously. Someone had tampered with his body, and those bruises weren't a natural part of his death. Her mind raced back to the funeral director's nervous behavior, the evasive answers, the autopsy report that didn't make sense. It all pointed to something bigger, something far darker than she could have imagined. But who could she trust with this footage? The police, the funeral home. Every option felt like a risk, and the weight of what she just uncovered was too heavy for her to carry alone. Yet she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let this go. Whatever they were trying to hide, she would bring it to light, no matter what it cost her. Denise knew she had no choice. The footage in her possession was undeniable. It was proof that someone had not only desecrated her son's body, but possibly played a role in his death. Her grief turned into a burning resolve. Isaiah deserved justice, and she was the only one who could make it happen. Her first step was to reach out to a lawyer she trusted, someone outside her immediate circle. She chose Mr. Daniels, a seasoned civil rights attorney in Sacramento. She drove 2 hours to his office, the video saved on a secure USB drive in her bag. The weight of her decision felt suffocating, but when she walked into his office, she stood tall. Mr. Daniels watched the footage in silence, his face a mask of professionalism, though Denise could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "This," he said, "finally is beyond criminal. We're dealing with something serious here." He explained the legal steps they'd need to take, starting with filing a police report. Denise hesitated. Her trust in the system was paper thin, but she nodded. She had to believe that the truth would prevail. The next day, they met with detectives at the police station. Denise handed over the footage, her voice steady as she recounted everything: the marks on Isaiah's neck, the funeral director's suspicious behavior, the whispers from his teammates, the lead detective, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Grant, promised a full investigation. But as the days turned into weeks, Denise quickly realized how complicated justice could be. The funeral home denied any wrongdoing, claiming the footage had been tampered with. The medical examiner's office refused to reopen Isaiah's case without new evidence. And then there were the veiled threats. Late one night her phone buzzed with an unknown number. When she answered, a low, menacing voice warned her to stop asking questions. Denise's hands shook, but she refused to be intimidated. She forwarded the call to Officer Grant, who assured her they would trace it. The investigation began to uncover shocking details. The funeral home had been implicated in multiple scandals over the years: missing belongings, mishandled bodies, and accusations of covering up foul play for high-paying clients. As more witnesses came forward, the web of corruption grew wider. But the most damning revelation came from Isaiah's teammates. Under police protection, one of the boys finally admitted what they'd been too scared to say earlier. The bruises on Isaiah's neck weren't an accident. He had been in a confrontation with someone with power, someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Denise's resolve only grew stronger. With the evidence mounting, the case went public. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Isaiah's name became a rallying cry for change. Protesters gathered outside the funeral home, demanding accountability through it all. Denise stood firm. Every interview, every court hearing, every late-night call with Mr. Daniels, she faced it all with the same fierce determination. But even as the truth began to surface, she knew this wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It was about every grieving family who'd been silenced, every injustice swept under the rug. And she wouldn't stop until the system was forced to change. The trial was long and grueling, filled with shocking testimonies and moments that left Denise clutching the edge of her seat. The funeral home's owner, backed into a corner by the evidence, finally admitted to a pattern of malpractice. The intruder, seen in the footage, was revealed to be an employee, acting under orders to cover up signs of foul play, bruises and other injuries that could have pointed to Isaiah's true cause of death. But the real breakthrough came when Isaiah's autopsy was re-examined by an independent medical expert. The report confirmed what Denise had suspected. All along, Isaiah's death was not from natural causes. He had been strangled. Her son's life had been taken from him, and the marks on his neck were proof of a violent struggle. The courtroom fell silent as the expert delivered their findings. Denise's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief and anguish. The truth was finally out, but it had come at a price. The guilty parties were sentenced. Both the funeral home and individuals involved in the cover-up faced legal consequences. The funeral home was shut down, and its name became synonymous with scandal and corruption. But for Denise, the victory felt hollow. Nothing could bring Isaiah back. Still, she knew her fight hadn't been in vain. The case sparked national outrage, leading to stricter regulations for funeral homes and more oversight in cases of unexpected deaths. Families reached out to Denise, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own stories of unanswered questions and buried truths. Months later, Denise stood at Isaiah's grave, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the cemetery. She placed fresh flowers at the headstone, her fingers brushing over the engraved words, "Forever loved, forever remembered." "I did it, Isaiah," she whispered. "I promised you I'd find the truth, and I did." Her voice cracked, but there was strength in it, a strength she never knew she had. As she turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace, not because her grief had lessened, but because her son's story had changed lives. She knew she would carry his memory forward, not just as a mother who lost her son, but as a woman who refused to let his death be in vain. When the truth is hidden, only the strongest hearts will uncover it. Denise's journey for justice was more than a fight for answers. It became a beacon for others. Feel inspired by Denise's strength? Hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Share this with someone who needs to know that justice is worth fighting for.